All right, Mr. Sapora here, marine biology, and this week we're going to be talking about marine environments. We're going to be starting our section on that, and we're going to be jumping off into our marine environment discussion, talking about our local area, of course. So, in looking at different marine environments as we get into these, really when you're starting on the shoreline, there's different zones as you move out into the ocean. We're going to talk about the intertidal zone later, and this is the zone that we're pretty much most familiar with. This is the zone that we can access on foot when the tide goes out. These are the tide pools, or the rocky intertidal zone, or even, consisting of the beach as well, which is sort of the littoral zone, as they call it as well, right where land and water meet. But we're going to be jumping into the subtidal zone and really talking about what we consider true marine environments that are totally underwater the whole time. Okay, let's get into it here. So regionally, looking at our area here, we live in an area that consists of temperate coastal seas. The ocean can be divided into three kind of broad categories as far as its general zonation goes. And this is zoned by temperatures, basically, which then control different types of organisms and where they're distributed in the ocean. These aren't like hard barriers, these are fluid barriers because we're talking about water here, so these do change seasonally and they change over time as climates shift and change as well. But the temperate coastal seas, they range in latitude. But roughly, they cover, between the Tropic of Cancer at 23.5 degrees latitude in the north, up to the Arctic Circle at 66.5 degrees latitude. But you can see there is some difference here, the way that ocean currents work and things like that, and circulation of air and marine gyres and all that. In the southern hemisphere, the same thing. They range between the Tropic of Capricorn and then the Arctic Circle in the south. And this map is a little bit disingenuous because it stretches, the bottom and the top to make them look equal, although they're not. So those are the temperate coastal sea zones. It's the dark blue bands that you see in here. In the middle, then, you would have the tropical zone, and then to the north and to the south, you would have what we call the polar zones. And what regulates these zones, or what gives them their distinction, would be water temperature. And so average water temperatures vary, but it's in a range in these temperate coastal seas, and the average water temperature is between 10 degrees to 18 degrees Celsius, or 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit for us. So it's cold, right? It's cold water. You need a wetsuit to get into it. When it gets up to about 65 here, where we are in Tillamook, it's pretty rare. Happens during El Nino years, and just occasionally in the summer, we can get a reversal of a currents. We can get a California current moving up our coastline, and that will bring some warmer water, but again, that's pretty rare. Usually around here, it's about 52 degrees Fahrenheit, or 10.5 degrees Celsius year-round in our area. And I just threw some images down here that really sort of conjure up the image of our temperate coastal seas. Anyway, there you go. Okay, and the zone that we're going to be talking about today within that temperate coastal sea zone is a zone right offshore. It's the right offshore zone, and we call it sublittoral. The littoral zone is the zone, what we call the intertidal zone. It literally touches the shore, and it's where you can walk. Below the littoral zone, or sublittoral, is what we call the Neritic-Benthic zone, also called subtidal zone, and meaning it's below the tides. And there's two words to unpack here. I'm doing it a little bit backwards, but the term benthic in marine biology or marine ecology refers to bottom. So benthic equals bottom, and this zone is made up of the ocean floor itself, soft sediments, right? Sand, silt, mudstones, other things like detritus, so dead organic matter that falls. A lot of that is made up of plankton. Siliceous ooze from diatoms, their shells and stuff, make up some marine sediment a little farther offshore. And of course, rocks, right? Any kind of rocky substrate that sticks up, that comes up above the sediment, is surrounded by it. That's the benthic zone. And 90% of all marine organisms are associated with the benthic zone. So this is really where you find life, is on the ocean floor. If you were to go scuba diving or snorkeling out in here, you really don't see much up near the surface or just in the water column itself. You have some of those pelagic species in there, nectonic and planktonic, but you really find a lot once you get down to the bottom. That's where all the life is hanging out, clinging to the bottom or associated with it in some way. So that's the benthic zone. When we talk about the neritic zone, think about it like near shore. It is anything that is basically just below the tide line down to about 200 meters deep is what we would consider the neritic zone. And looking on our little map down here in the bottom right, put a little circle around it. There we go. So the neritic zone right offshore, 0 to 200 meters deep, that puts you in this also this upper photic zone, meaning that this is where light will penetrate to. Light will reach the bottom of the ocean in the Neritic-Benthic zone. And because light penetrates to the bottom, because there's substrate, there's organic matter, there's a place to, there's a substrate, there's a surface to either burrow into or to cling onto. This is the most productive part of the ocean. And globally, we'll look at some maps. You can see that it is the most productive part of the oceans around the world. The Neritic-Benthic zone is where most of life occurs. Flipping through back into this. And so just continuing here on this chain of the Neritic-Benthic zone. In Oregon, this zone extends for about 40 miles offshore, and it's what we commonly refer to as the continental shelf. It's the shallow shelf that extends from land and slopes out gently, and then eventually it drops off into the continental slope, or the continental rise, and then drops to the deep abyssal plain. So looking here just at a Google Maps, looking up the coastline here, you can see this Neritic-Benthic zone is everything extending from land itself out about 40 miles or more, and then it drops off. And this is what we call the continental shelf out here. It's between, 0 at the shore to about 600 feet deep on the edge. The average depth is about 300 feet deep for this, though, most of the way. And this is by far the most productive area of the ocean, and this is true around the world. These continental shelves are where you find most life. Sailors used to have a saying that, when crossing the ocean, that you knew you were getting near land when you saw life. When you saw birds, when you saw fish, when you saw whales, and all of those things were concentrated off this continental shelf here. Now, it doesn't mean that it's, right up next to shore. It's concentrated all along it, and right along the edge here of the continental shelf, where the continental shelf and slope meet in this zone right in here, the currents happen, it's called upwelling. Marine currents come cruising in, they hit this shelf, and then they rise up along the edge. And let me just tilt it here a little bit so they kind of come sailing in, they hit it, they rise up along the edge, and they dredge up a lot of nutrients, cold, oxygen-rich waters as well, and it mixes with the surface, with the light, and this area right along the shelf slope interface here is very productive as well. It's where you find a lot of fish species. It's where a lot of plankton and other things grow and occur and thrive. Because of that, you get a lot of small bait fish, and then you get things like tuna. This is where you'd go tuna fishing. This is also where you find a lot of seabirds as well. Some cool features of our Neritic-Benthic shelf. Here's the mouth of the Columbia River coming out right here. And during the Ice Age, ocean levels around the world were 300 feet lower. They were 300 feet lower because 300 feet of ocean water was taken off the top and converted into ice on land, right? As it evaporated, it collected as these large continental glaciers that covered, all of Canada, basically, and northern Europe and Asia in this big block of ice, and lowered the ocean level 300 feet. Because of that, the Columbia River came out here during that time. It flowed and it carved this canyon. That's called the Astoria Canyon, and sediment pours out all across the bottom of the continental shelf there. Kind of cool to think about that way. And the little blue dot is where I am recording right now. There's Tillamook. Woohoo! There we are. Okay. Let's get back into this. Let's go. Okay. And again, this Neritic-Benthic zone consists of submerged rocks and deposits of sediment and detritus. I think I already mentioned that note before. And the lower intertidal, so species also abundant in this zone. This is where you get all your kelp forest. They occur in this Neritic-Benthic zone. They don't occur out in the deep ocean. They have nothing to anchor to. We'll talk about those later. So this is where you would find, in abundance, a lot of the species we have off our species list. This is where you're going to be finding them. So your algae, right? Your laminaria, rat kelp, your Nerocystis, your bull kelp, the quintessential sort of kelp that makes up most of our kelp forest, and, grows 30 meters or 90 feet in a single year. Metridium, Urticina, Tilosarchus, all of our species that we've had on our species list occur in abundance here as well. Cool beans. Oh yeah, talking about right there. And now we want to jump into a specific ecosystem within this larger region. And one of these important marine environments, of course, the most important here in the temperate coastal seas are the kelp forests. These are the most productive areas. Kelp forests are made up of dominated by brown algae. If you remember before, there's three types of algae that occur. There's brown, red, and then green. Green algae, only a fraction of them actually occur in the ocean. Most of them are freshwater. And so your marine algae generally are dominated by browns and reds, and your browns are by far the largest. And so they are in a group called the laminarales, and they make up the dominant sort of structure of your kelp forest. They're your bull kelps, laminaria, egregia, as you can see in here in this diagram. Here's your feather boa kelp near shore, laminaria just below that, and then as you move out, we get bull kelp, Nerocystis, and Macrocystis is another close relative of Nerocystis, and that occurs a little further south of us in southern Oregon, northern California. And farther out, there's even this elk or elkhorn kelp as well, a close relative of those. And these dominate Neritic-Benthic areas where you have a rocky substrate. Your kelps don't anchor to sand. Sand constantly moves. These are not a rooting plant, so they don't put roots down into a sediment, and we'll talk about the structure of them later. They simply attach to something, and they have to have something then to attach to. So anywhere there's rocks along our coastline is where you're going to find them. Lucky for us, we have a rocky coastline. So rocky coastlines tend to be more productive. You think of them as being a bit more ferocious than they are. But for as far as waves and wave attack goes, but if you think about if you're an organism, sand is constantly shifting underneath you, and that's a very abrasive and harsh environment. So it's good if you're a burrowing organism, but for any algae or things, it's a very tough environment to grow in. So kelp forests are dominant where there are rocks, and we live along a very rocky coastline because it's a geologically active coastline. There's a lot of uplifting here. There's a lot of plate movement, and that plate movement forces the edge of the continent to slowly rise upward, just a couple millimeters a year. But if you add that up over millions of years, you get thousands of feet of uplift. That explains the coast range behind us and the cliffs we have along our seashore. Now, at the same time that this coastline is rising upward, waves are coming in and attacking it because it's ever shallowing. So it's creating this, an area where the swells will basically form into waves and then attack the coastline, so to speak. And those waves then break apart those rocks, so it makes a very cliff, steep, and rugged terrain. And kelp forests occur worldwide in temperate and polar oceans, not in tropical zones. The kelp forests don't really occur in tropics. Coral reefs tend to take over there, and a lot of your productivity is actually in the coral reefs, interestingly enough, done by animals, corals, cnidarians, but animals that have an algae component living symbiotically inside of them. So that productivity kind of gets taken care of on that level, starting off the food chain. Kind of a trippy way to do it. And in our area, it's your basic sort of, food chain, starting with your primary producers, wholly primary producers at the bottom, your kelps, and then working its way up. Species in the shallow areas, again, laminaria, and in the deeper areas, Nerocystis, and I mentioned before, Macrocystis, a relative of it. In the image here, you can also see this is a Nerocystis forest. This is bull kelp, and forming what we call literally a kelp forest. And it does provide that forest-like structure of giving a canopy up top. So you have the the main stem of it growing up here, and then the ball at the top, which contains carbon dioxide, I think a little bit of carbon monoxide to help it float, and then the blades. They're not called leaves, they're called blades, but they do the same thing, right? They float out and they do photosynthesis that catch that sunlight at the top, and that creates a canopy for organisms to then find shelter and hide in. So a lot of fish species live or rely on within the kelp forest for protection and shelter. And then, of course, other things hunt there, right? Seals are commonly found in there, foraging and eating fish and things like that. When the tide goes out, the kelp forest, the kelp heads tend to nod to the side. When the tide comes in, they can even be submerged, as you see in here. And then here's a shot sort of showing, the whole angle there, looking kind of bougie. And kelp forests are some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth as well. Right up there with estuaries or with tropical rainforest as far as the amount of biomass produced in a single year. And by biomass, I mean the actual weight of things produced in that environment within a single year, growth. And here's a picture of some of our kelp forest from the bottom up. You're looking right in here at a laminaria forest. So you've got a narrow little stipe here, and then you start to get into the blade itself. And then the holdfasts, which they use to attach to the rocks. Again, they don't root, they just cement themselves, these alien-like gripping holdfast structures. In a sense, they're kind of proto-roots. Roots evolved on land to be able to pull water out of the soil. Water's not an issue here. They're surrounded by it, so they don't need to pull it up from anything. And the nutrients they get are in the water itself. They're not they don't pull them from the rock. So they just need this to anchor. It's just an anchoring device. And here's some more images of the kelp forest, and again, the holdfasts and some of the organisms in them. They can be kind of shady and dark in there. They're really fun to scuba dive through. And I like to scuba dive. I spearfish as well. So going through a kelp forest is where I would, if I was out in the ocean looking for a spot to go spearfishing, that's the kind of the areas you want to zero in on. They're held a boat through, though, if you've got a boat with a prop. In Alaska, when we worked in the Aleutians, we would carry paddles in our boat, and when we get up to a kelp forest, we'd have to turn the motor off, tilt it up, bring the prop out of the water, and then use paddles to move through the kelp forest until we could get through it. And sometimes they can be very extensive up in Alaska. We'll talk about why that is in just a hot second here. That's a cool image. That's a great perspective there. And you can really see the fish diversity in here too, some of the bait fish. A lot of these are different varieties of perch. We have quite a number of perch, and this looks like a rockfish right here as well. And globally, here's some of the distribution of the kelp forest, and then the dominant genuses that form the sort of overarching dominant species structure of those. So along the Pacific here, it is Nerocystis bull kelp, and then Macrocystis, which grows up and down the coast. Macrocystis down here, Nerocystis more up here. Most of your kelp forests are dominated by these, and then to a lesser extent, you'll get laminarias and egregias and other things. Now, if you move down to South America, again, they're not in the polar regions, they skip it, but then down in here you get Macrocystis as well, so the same genus, but then you get another genus, Lawsonia, which we don't have up here. Macrocystis and Lawsonia dominate down in here. Now you may wonder how it can get from here to there. Well, it's in the ocean and they produce spores, so these spores can carry and drift for quite a ways, and then they can settle further down in there. Laminarias dominate in the Atlantic. Off the coast of South Africa, you've got Macrocystis laminaria and then Ecklonia. Macrocystis thecalonia down in here in Australia, and then laminarias dominate over in Asia, which is interesting. But they have a slightly warmer water current and a slightly different one than we do, although it's still pretty cold up here off the Kamchatka Peninsula, I believe. And this is the Sea of Okhotsk, if you remember that from earlier on in the year. Okay, so you can see the distribution of kelps around the world, and also you can kind of see the evolutionary distribution of these things, which is kind of cool. I always like big maps like that. And then stepping off from our shoreline in our area, again, egregia near, and then you get laminarias, and then you get your bull kelps, and then farther deeper out you can get macrocystis, although again a little further south from us where that occurs. Okay, kelp forests, we're going to talk a little bit about the structure of them and what they're made of. So at the bottom of a blade of a marine kelp, the bottom part is not a root, it's called a holdfast, and I put a hyperlink in here. Let's see where this takes us. Page not found, so apparently I put a broken hyperlink in there, or at least at one time it was thriving in the world, and now it's not. But you can see the holdfast down in here. They cement themselves to the rock with a type of glue that they produce and make, and NASA has synthesized this glue, studied it and synthesized it because of its amazing sort of, gluish properties, if you will, but really, really, really strong stuff. And it's pretty amazing, if you think about the beating that these things take from the ocean, especially during large storms. And there's a type of kelp that occurs a little further south of us in southern Oregon, central Oregon, called sea palm, which grows just in these gnarly wave zones, and you just see it getting thrashed by 40-foot waves, and it just hangs on, just kind of moves back and forth. But it's also in a zone then when the waves pull out, it's got lots of sunlight, so it's a zone where something would want to grow if it could, and it's evolved a way to be able to do that. And they provide crucial habitat for many associated species. I probably have a link here. Let's see if this one works. Hey, look at that. Okay, ecology of seaweeds and its environmental significance. So I attached an article here, and this is from the University of California, Santa Barbara. That school pumps out a lot of excellent wildlife biologists and marine biologists, many of which I've worked with over the years. And if I can get this article to scroll down. Well, it opened, but now it won't scroll for me. Why? It's a touchscreen. Does that work? It's still loading. I'll jump back to it. And rockfish, perch, urchins, abalone, nudibranchs, anemones are all associated with this and rely on this for habitat. Not just for cover and for protection, but for actually something to cling to and live on, as you can see here with this nudibranch. In Oregon, we have close to 30 different species of rockfish. And rockfish in our region belong to the genus Sebastes. And again, there's 30 different species of Sebastes, family Sebastidae, here in Oregon. And I believe this shows you some global distribution of them, but you can see a huge diversity here along the Pacific coast. And most of these, and many of them, are reliant on kelp forest in some way or another. And so you could kind of click through here and take a look at some of these. Let's see here, about. So it kind of runs through some of the life histories of some of these. Yeah, and then that family does include scorpionfish and stonefish as well, although we don't have those right here. They're delicious and tasty. Some of them are endangered here on the Oregon coast too, so it's important to have a guide with you when you're fishing, not like a person guide, but just a identification guide to tell what you're looking at and make sure you don't catch the wrong one. And this article here then goes over the basic structure of a kelp structure. So you've got the holdfast at the bottom. The stem that arises from it is not a stem, it's called a stipe. It doesn't have vascular tissue that's carrying nutrients back and forth, the xylem and phloem, like you would on a terrestrial plant. And again, we don't call them leaves, we call them blades, and they often also have this air bladder inside of them. And then this goes in and talks about the kelp forest community and some of the definitions for the vocab there. Cool beans. Okay. So kelp forests are again highly important part of the ecosystem, and we have some pretty good ones here. Some of our best kelp forests occur on the north side of Cape Lookout. There is an extensive kelp forest right in that little nook there near the campground. If you walk out from there, um, that's a really good one. And now I want to talk about sea otters in kelp forests. So one of the organisms that feeds on kelp are the purple sea urchins, Strongylocentrotus purpuratus. If you remember from our species list, these can live an incredibly long time. They're an echinoderm. They have a hard calcareous shell around them and then calcareous spines that protect them. They're not poisonous, but they're painful and they kind of shatter in your skin if you get them broken off. And then here you got little tiny black tube feet that they use to feel their environment and move around. Underneath them, if you flip them over, they have a hole, and uh, it's where their mouth, 5 little teeth stick out. And these little teeth, oh, you can see it right here on the sea otter's belly. He's got them upside down. And the little teeth they use to grind away at kelp on yeah. So anyway, they grind away at the holdfast. They eat the stem. They'll climb up it and eat the stem of the kelp. And so they're herbivorous, vegetarians, and they're grazers, sort of like your land herbivores are, like cows or deer or elk. And they will decimate and wipe out a kelp bed if unchecked. Well, the thing that checks them in the natural environment here on our coastline would be sea otters, although sea otters have been removed from Oregon completely. They used to occur all the way from California through Alaska and then into Asia as well, to Japan. They've been hunted out in Japan, and they occur in Alaska still in pretty good numbers, actually, along the coast of Canada and then down into Washington to Olympic National Park as a sea otter population. Then from southern Washington down, you really don't find them all through Oregon, and there is a small population in Monterey Bay that was reintroduced and is now thriving down in there. Sea otters eat a variety of things, mollusks as well, but they really specialize in feeding on sea urchins. It's one of their favorite foods. They will gather them up, as you can see here, and they can just crush them with their molars. They can use rocks to break them and stuff as well, but it's one of their main food sources. Now, sea otters will then keep the sea urchin population in check. And by keeping the sea urchin population in check, it keeps the sea urchins from growing too numerous to where they basically overgraze and eat and destroy all the kelp forest. So what you usually find in association with the healthy sea otter population is a healthy kelp forest, because by limiting the number of sea urchins, it promotes the growth and the flourishing of the kelp beds. And so in Alaska, you have these extensive kelp beds. Off the Olympic coast, you have these extensive kelp beds. And by I mean extensive, they can be tens of miles long continuously, and they will stretch out offshore quite far. Here we just don't have that. We have these little patchy groups of kelp, but not the extensive kelp beds that we probably historically did have. And that has a larger impact on the entire ecosystem. Without these extensive kelp beds, our fish populations have dropped and declined from what they were historically, and there's no real chance for them to rebound because they just don't have the habitat to exist in until the kelp forests come back. Now, some things that have been done to help improve kelp forests. Humans eat sea urchins as well. There's a huge market for them. Most of us don't, at least, most people I know don't eat them. I've tried them. I don't really enjoy them. But in Asia, there's a huge market for them, and they're trying to develop markets for them. And then people go and dive and collect sea urchins. So the physical human removal of sea urchins is one way to promote the growth, the regrowth, and the flourishing of kelp forests. And I know down in Port Orford, Oregon, in southern Oregon, off the Red Rock Reef Marine Reserve, there's been some work done there to create a local fishery for sea urchins, for the export of them, to promote it, and to Asia. And so they've been working, trying to do that, and then they're trying to employ locals to go out and dive. And so it creates a local economy, which is a great thing. And that also then rehabilitates and the habitat, and then that also has benefits for local commercial fishermen as well. So it's this real payoff on both sides. So here's what a healthy system looks like with sea otters. And then you can see, with otters, you get nice kelp forest. Without otters, you get these really seas of sea urchins. And I've seen areas like this, especially on clear days when you're diving or just boating over, especially in a skiff or something like that, where you can see down. You'll just see purple sea urchins just blanketing the floor, and they're everywhere. And they're really just going to town. And yeah, not necessarily a great thing. All right. So that is it. Not a lot of notes and information this week. I wanted to keep it kind of short and sweet. And on the weekly questions this week, then, I haven't put page numbers up, but I will try and get those up from the textbook. There is a section in there on kelp forest. You can find it. I just don't have a copy on me right now. So the questions are: describe the global range and characteristics of temperate coastal seas. Define and describe the Neritic-Benthic zone in detail and how far offshore it occurs along the Oregon coast. And we had looked at that here. It's about 40 miles offshore before you drop down, and it gets deeper, and then you enter the pelagic or oceanic zone. Define the term kelp forest and summarize in your own words what they are and where they occur in the world. And so again, kelp forest first. I showed you that map, and that map is on the slideshow showing where they occur globally and some of the genuses. You could address that. And then the role that kelp forests play ecologically. And we just discussed that. I also found an article here that I think is good and interesting. It's embedded in Wikipedia, and it talks about bottom-up or top-down trophic processes in an ecosystem, and sort of their influence on that ecosystem. And I want you to read that and figure that out for yourself. And let me know if you have any questions about that. And then also discuss the roles that sea otters play in balancing sea urchin populations, and then how the larger impact that has on all of the trophic levels. By trophic levels in ecology, we mean feeding levels. You can look this up. There's information. The article I have is Trophic Ecology here, and it's specifically with kelp forests and sea otters. It's just one huge beefy paragraph and then two short ones, so not too much, and then just write a short summary on that in the space there. And I've also included for you really one of the craziest videos I've ever seen made by these guys in Scandinavia. And I'm including that just because I'm me, and it's funny. So there you go. All right. That's it. And cut.